In the hushed chambers of the United States Capitol, on a crisp winter morning in early January 2026, history was quietly being rewritten. The House of Representatives was in session, debating what many had assumed would be yet another routine piece of legislation amid the post-election adjustments. But buried deep in a broader oversight bill was a provision that would send shockwaves across the nation. A bipartisan subpoena demanding 25 years of former President Donald Trump's personal and business financial records, including tax returns, banking statements, and details of foreign dealings. The vote came swiftly and unexpectedly. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, Democrats eager for transparency, and a surprising number of Republicans concerned about lingering questions from Trump's business empire, joined forces. The measure passed with a comfortable margin, marking one of the rare moments of cross-party unity in a deeply divided Congress. Speakers on the floor emphasized the need for accountability, citing ongoing concerns about potential conflicts of interest that had shadowed Trump's presidency and post-presidency years. "This is not about one man," declared the committee chair, a veteran Democrat, "but about ensuring that no one, regardless of position, is above scrutiny in our democracy." News of the subpoena broke almost immediately, flashing across television screens and social media feeds. Pundits scrambled to analyze the bipartisan nature of the vote, a true shakeup in Washington, where partisan lines had hardened like concrete over the past decade. Some Republicans who supported it framed it as a necessary step to close old chapters and move forward, while others quietly distanced themselves, aware of the potential backlash from Trump's loyal base, at Mar-a-Lago, the opulent Florida estate that had become Trump's post-White House headquarters. The former president was in the midst of a strategy meeting with close advisors. The room, adorned with gold accents and family portraits, fell silent as an aide burst in with a tablet displaying the breaking news alert. Trump's face, usually composed in public, tightened as he read the headline. He set the tablet down slowly, his eyes narrowing. "They think they can do this?" he muttered, his voice rising with each word. What followed was a torrent of frustration, an intense, heated reaction that those in the room would later describe as one of the most visceral they had witnessed as Trump paced the room, venting his anger at what he called an unprecedented overreach. His phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. He grabbed it and started typing furiously, his thumbs flying across the screen. Within minutes, the first posts appeared on his social media platform, setting off a digital storm that would dominate the news cycle for days to come. The bipartisan shakeup in Congress had ignited a firestorm, and Trump's response was just beginning to unfold. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palm-lined grounds of Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's initial wave of posts hit the internet like a thunderclap. The former president, still seething from the morning's news, had retreated to his private office, a room filled with memorabilia from his political career, including framed magazine covers and signed memorabilia from world leaders. Surrounded by a small circle of trusted aides, he dictated and edited messages with rapid intensity, his voice echoing off the walls as he demanded stronger language to convey his outrage. The first post appeared shortly after 2 p.m. Eastern Time, a lengthy statement decrying the subpoena as a witch hunt revived from the past, accusing Congress of partisan harassment despite the bipartisan vote that had authorized it. He claimed the demand for 25 years of financial records, spanning his entire business career and presidency, was an unconstitutional invasion of privacy, designed not for legitimate oversight but to damage his reputation and distract from the nation's priorities. "They've been after me for years, and now even some Republicans are joining in. This is a disgrace," he wrote, promising to fight the subpoena all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. Within minutes, the posts went viral. Trump's platform, already a hub for his most dedicated supporters, lit up with shares, comments, and echoes of his words. Supporters flooded the replies with messages of solidarity, calling the congressional action an abuse of power and rallying behind hashtags that quickly trended nationwide. Cable news networks interrupted regular programming to read the statements live, with anchors noting the sharp tone and the former president's direct attacks on members of his own party who had supported the measure. But Trump wasn't done. Over the next hour, a barrage followed, more than a dozen posts in quick succession, each building on the last. He named specific lawmakers who had voted in favor, labeling them as disloyal and predicting political consequences in upcoming elections. He questioned the timing of the subpoena, suggesting it was retaliation for his ongoing influence in Republican politics and his vocal criticism of certain policies. One particularly heated message described the bipartisan vote as evidence of a deep state conspiracy that transcended party lines, vowing that the American people would see through it. Aides in the room exchanged uneasy glances as Trump's energy escalated. He paced back and forth, gesturing emphatically while referencing past legal battles over his finances that he had ultimately navigated. "This is bigger than the Russia hoax, bigger than the impeachments. They want everything," he exclaimed, directing staff to pull up old statements from opponents to highlight what he saw as hypocrisy. The atmosphere grew tense. One advisor gently suggested toning down the rhetoric to avoid alienating potential allies, but Trump brushed it aside, insisting that silence would be seen as weakness. By early evening, the reaction had spiraled into a full media frenzy. Political commentators dissected every word, with some praising Trump's defiance as a stand for executive privilege principles, while others criticized the intensity as unbecoming and divisive. The bipartisan aspect of the congressional vote became a focal point. Analysts pointed out how unusual it was for Republicans to join Democrats on such a targeted measure against a figure still central to their party. Interviews with lawmakers poured in. Those who supported the subpoena defended it as essential for transparency and closing unresolved questions about potential conflicts during Trump's time in office, emphasizing that the probe was narrowly focused on public integrity, not personal vendettas. As night fell over Florida, Trump's posts continued sporadically, each one drawing millions of views and amplifying the story. The meltdown, as headlines were already calling it, showed no signs of abating. Legal experts began weighing in on television panels, predicting a protracted court battle that could drag on for months or years. Meanwhile, inside Mar-a-Lago, preparations were underway for what came next. Consultations with attorneys, strategy sessions, and the mobilization of a broader response. The bipartisan shakeup in Washington had not only reopened old wounds, but had provoked a fierce counterattack, setting the stage for an intense political and legal confrontation that would grip the nation. The following day, January 6, 2026, dawned clear and mild in Washington, D.C., but the political atmosphere was anything but calm. News of the bipartisan subpoena continued to dominate headlines, with morning talk shows dissecting Trump's overnight social media barrage and the unusual cross-party coalition that had made it possible. Analysts noted that the vote reflected growing fatigue among some Republicans with unresolved questions about Trump's financial history, particularly in light of recent discussions around government transparency and ethics reforms. Democrats, meanwhile, hailed it as a victory for accountability, insisting the broad scope, covering 25 years of records, was necessary to fully examine potential conflicts and foreign influences. Back at Mar-a-Lago, Trump had barely slept. Aides reported that he spent much of the night reviewing drafts of statements and consulting with his legal team via late-night calls. By mid-morning, he announced plans for an impromptu press conference on the estate's grand patio, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Word spread quickly through conservative media outlets, and soon, cameras from major networks were setting up as supporters gathered outside the gates, waving flags and signs in solidarity. Trump emerged just after noon, flanked by a few loyal advisors and family members. Dressed in his signature dark suit and red tie, he approached the podium with a determined stride, but his expression betrayed the lingering anger from the day before. "Good afternoon, folks," he began, his voice steady at first. "Yesterday we saw something truly unbelievable. A group in Congress, including some people who call themselves Republicans, vote to go on a fishing expedition into my private finances, going back 25 years. This is harassment, pure and simple." The crowd of reporters murmured as Trump leaned forward, his tone sharpening. He reiterated his claims from the posts, that the subpoena was politically motivated, an attempt to undermine his influence ahead of key midterm battles and beyond. He accused the bipartisan supporters of betrayal, naming several Republican lawmakers and warning that their actions would not be forgotten by voters. "These rhinos think they can join the Democrats in this witch hunt and get away with it? The people know better. They're tired of the endless attacks on me, on our movement." As he spoke, Trump's gestures grew more animated, pointing emphatically, shaking his head in disbelief. He pivoted to defending his business record, boasting of successes that had created jobs and wealth long before politics. "I've built an incredible company, and everything was done legally and properly, better than anyone else, frankly." He promised an aggressive legal challenge, vowing to take the fight to the courts and expose what he called flaws in the congressional process. The press conference stretched on for nearly an hour, with Trump fielding questions that ranged from supportive to probing. When asked about the bipartisan nature of the vote, his response was particularly pointed. "It's a shakeup, all right. A shakeup by weak people who don't understand what the American people want. But we'll shake it right back." Laughter rippled from some in the audience, but the underlying tension was palpable. BY evening. Clips from the event were circulating widely, amplifying Trump's message. His supporters organized rapid response rallies in several states, echoing his themes of overreach and defiance. On the other side, proponents of the subpoena appeared on rival networks, calmly explaining the measure's focus on public interest and historical precedents for oversight of former officials' finances. Inside political circles, the bipartisan shakeup began to reveal cracks. Some Republican lawmakers who voted for the subpoena faced immediate backlash from party leaders and donors, with calls for primary challenges already emerging. Others stood firm in private statements, arguing that addressing lingering transparency issues was essential for the party's long-term health. As the day wound down, Trump's team shifted focus to the next phase, assembling a top-tier legal defense and coordinating with allies on Capitol Hill. The meltdown had evolved from digital outbursts and a fiery press appearance into a full-fledged counteroffensive. With court filings expected imminently and public opinion deeply divided, the battle over the financial records was poised to intensify, testing the limits of congressional power, executive privilege claims, and party loyalty in a way few had anticipated just days earlier. By the morning of January 7, 2026, the political storm surrounding the congressional subpoena had entered a new, more structured phase. At Mar-a-Lago, the festive holiday decorations from New Year's were long gone, replaced by stacks of legal briefs and notepads covering the long mahogany table in Trump's private conference room. A team of high-profile attorneys, veterans of past battles over tax returns, emoluments clauses, and executive privilege, had flown in overnight. The former president, fueled by black coffee and determination, chaired a marathon strategy session that began at dawn and stretched well into the afternoon. The focus was clear: mount an immediate and multifaceted legal challenge to block or severely limit the subpoena's reach. Lawyers outlined several avenues of attack. First, they argued that demanding 25 years of personal and business financial records constituted an excessive and overly broad intrusion, far beyond what was reasonably needed for legitimate congressional oversight. Second, they planned to revive claims of executive privilege, even for a former president, asserting that certain documents from his time in office remained protected. Third, they intended to question the bipartisan committee's authority, suggesting procedural irregularities in how the subpoena was attached to the larger bill and voted on. Trump listened intently, interjecting with pointed questions and reminders of previous victories in court. "We've beaten them before on this stuff," he said firmly, referencing earlier cases where judges had narrowed or delayed similar requests for his financial records. "Make it strong. Show them this isn't going to be easy." As the discussion progressed, his frustration from the initial meltdown channeled into a more focused resolve. He approved the filing of emergency motions in federal court seeking to quash the subpoena entirely or, at minimum, to stay its enforcement pending full litigation, by late afternoon. The first filings were submitted electronically to the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. Trump's legal team issued a public statement describing the lawsuit as a necessary defense of constitutional principles, warning that unchecked congressional demands could set dangerous precedents for future presidents and private citizens alike. No American should be subjected to this kind of endless, retroactive harassment, the statement read, echoing Trump's own words from the previous days. The filings instantly reignited media coverage. Legal analysts on evening news programs pored over the arguments, noting that while some claims had been tested and partially rejected, in prior cases during Trump's presidency, the broader 25-year scope and post-presidency context introduced fresh complexities. Court watchers predicted a lengthy process. Initial hearings within weeks, possible appeals climbing through the circuit courts, and potentially reaching the Supreme Court by late 2026 or early 2027. On Capitol Hill, the bipartisan coalition behind the subpoena responded swiftly. The committee's leadership held a brief press availability, reaffirming their commitment to the oversight effort. "Congress has a constitutional duty to investigate matters of public trust," one Democratic co-sponsor stated, joined by a Republican colleague who added, "This isn't personal. It's about ensuring full transparency on issues that affected national policy." Behind the scenes, however, tensions simmered. Several Republicans who voted for the measure faced mounting pressure from party leadership and grassroots activists loyal to Trump, with fundraising emails and calls flooding their offices demanding explanations. Public reaction remained deeply polarized. Polls conducted overnight showed Trump's base overwhelmingly viewing the subpoena as unfair persecution, while independents and Democrats largely supported greater financial disclosure for former high officials. Social media continued to buzz, with Trump's platform serving as the epicenter for coordinated defenses and fundraising appeals tied to the legal fight as night fell. Trump appeared briefly on a friendly cable news program via remote link from Mar-a-Lago. Calmer than in his initial outbursts but still resolute, he framed the court challenge as a stand not just for himself but for every American facing government overreach. They're going to spend millions of taxpayer dollars trying to get records they've wanted for years, and they'll lose again, he predicted confidently. With the legal machinery now in motion, the bipartisan shakeup had transformed into a high-stakes courtroom drama. Both sides dug in for what promised to be a protracted battle, one that would test judicial patience, political alliances, and the enduring boundaries between congressional authority and individual privacy in the post-Trump era. The meltdown's raw emotion had given way to calculated resistance, but the underlying conflict showed no signs of resolution. Weeks turned into months as 2026 progressed, and the battle over the congressional subpoena for Donald Trump's 25-year financial records settled into a familiar rhythm of legal briefs, courtroom arguments, and intermittent public flare-ups. The initial meltdown that had gripped headlines in early January gradually gave way to a more sustained, lower-intensity conflict, but its effects rippled far beyond the courtroom. reshaping alliances, conversations, and the political landscape in lasting ways. In the courts, Trump's legal team scored early procedural victories. A federal district judge granted a temporary stay on portions of the subpoena in late February, agreeing that the 25-year scope appeared unusually broad and required further justification from Congress. Appeals followed swiftly on both sides, with oral arguments in the D.C. Circuit drawing packed galleries of observers and intense media scrutiny. Legal scholars debated the nuances nightly on television. The balance between congressional oversight authority and individual privacy rights, the applicability of executive privilege to a former president, and whether the bipartisan nature of the vote strengthened or complicated the committee's position. Trump himself maintained a steady public presence throughout the process. His social media posts became less frequent but no less pointed, often highlighting favorable court developments or criticizing delays as evidence of judicial caution against overreach. At rallies and fundraisers across the country, he wove the subpoena fight into his broader narrative of endurance against establishment forces. "They thought this would finish me," he would tell cheering crowds. "But look, they're the ones looking weak now." Supporters responded enthusiastically, channeling donations toward legal defense funds and midterm candidates who pledged unwavering loyalty. On Capitol Hill, the bipartisan shakeup that had sparked the entire episode proved both fragile and revealing. Several Republican lawmakers who had supported the subpoena faced fierce primary challenges funded by Trump-aligned groups, with mixed outcomes in the spring primaries. A few held their seats through moderate voter coalitions, while others saw their political careers effectively ended. The episode exposed lingering divisions within the party. One faction argued that confronting unresolved transparency questions was necessary to broaden appeal, while the dominant wing viewed any cooperation on Trump-related investigations as unacceptable weakness. Democratic leaders, sensing opportunity, kept the issue alive in committee hearings, though they carefully framed it as institutional oversight rather than personal targeting. Public opinion, as measured by ongoing polls, remained sharply divided along partisan lines but showed subtle shifts. A majority continued to believe that former presidents should disclose tax returns and financial dealings as a matter of norm, yet sympathy for what many viewed as endless investigations grew among independents. Media coverage evolved too, from the initial frenzy of meltdown headlines to more measured analyses of constitutional questions and political consequences. By late summer 2026, a compromise began to emerge quietly behind the scenes. Court-mediated discussions suggested a narrowed subpoena, perhaps focusing on specific years tied to known foreign transactions or potential conflicts during the presidency, rather than the full quarter-century originally demanded. Neither side publicly admitted negotiation, but leaks indicated both recognized the risks of an all-or-nothing Supreme Court ruling that could set sweeping precedents as autumn approached. The immediate crisis faded from daily headlines, replaced by election season priorities. Yet the episode left an indelible mark. It reinforced Trump's narrative of perpetual victimization among his base while simultaneously highlighting the limits of bipartisan cooperation on matters touching his legacy. Congress passed modest ethics reforms in unrelated bills, partly inspired by the debate, establishing clearer guidelines for future financial disclosures without directly resolving the Trump case. In the end, the bipartisan shakeup and the intense reaction it provoked did not produce a dramatic final revelation or total victory for either side. Instead, it became another chapter in the ongoing story of accountability, power, and division in American politics, one that underscored how deeply personal financial scrutiny had become intertwined with national governance and how quickly unity could fracture under pressure. The records fight continued in the courts, but the larger conversation it ignited about transparency, privacy, and political loyalty endured long after the initial storm had passed.